Happy Friday, everyone. I think we still got a few more people coming in, so just hang tight and we'll get started here in just a few. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I almost said good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Friday. Welcome to today's wellness webinar. I'm so excited that you're all joining me today. I know it's Friday, and I know it's getting towards the end of the week, and I know it's right after lunch. It's a very great time to be tired and lethargic and fall asleep at your desk, but I hope you don't do that today. I'm pretty excited about this topic and what we're talking about. So if you got to, stand up, stretch a little bit, do something to get the blood flowing, because I think we're going to have a good discussion today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Charles Burroughs, and I'm the Fitness Services Coordinator for University Recreation. I'm starting to recognize quite a few names now in these presentations. I've done a couple of them. But for those of you who don't know me, I've been in this role at UA for about 4 years now. And I've been working in fitness for just short of 10 years. And I love doing this. This is definitely my passion, and especially today's topic. You know, I've spent a lot of time not just managing personal training, but also doing it, you know, working with clients over the years in different settings and teaching classes. And so this is a topic that I'm really familiar with, not just professionally, but also personally. You know, fitness wasn't always something that I liked or cared about. It really wasn't until college for me that I started to exercise and started to make some healthy choices and decisions, because at the time I definitely needed to lose some weight. And so movement is something that's really important to me, because I realized, you know, through most of my childhood and even into college, that I was experiencing a lot of injuries. And now, there could definitely be other reasons for that, but one of the biggest reasons was that I did not know how to move correctly. And it wasn't just that I didn't know proper form, but as I learned years later, I actually had a lot of muscular dysfunctions and imbalances that caused me to hurt myself when I try to move correctly. And so this is something that I've spent a lot of time learning about, and something that I'm passionate about because of it. And so I really hope that today, you can take something interesting away from this and maybe learn something new that can help you. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, is how to move better. Or another way of thinking about it is how to enhance your fitness, and activities of daily living through intentional movement. That's going to be the key here, is an intentional movement. So let's start. There we go. So let's actually start with some facts. For those of you who have seen me present before, you may have seen this, but it's worth talking about again. And it's a very important fact that 1 in 5 adults right now in the US do not actually meet 1 in 5 adults in the US meet the recommended physical activity guidelines that have been set by the CDC and the American Heart Association, a few other organizations who work together. They put together these guidelines that say, if you follow these guidelines, you can receive benefit from regular exercise. But what's crazy is that right now, 80% of the adult population here do not meet those guidelines. And that's definitely a problem. We know that physical activity does impact our health positively. We can get great benefits from it. And while I'm not going to go into all the many different benefits of exercise, there are definitely some big ones I will touch on. People who are physically active, they tend to live longer. The numbers show that people who exercise regularly tend to have a longer lifespan than those who don't. We also see that exercise also helps to reduce risk of heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, depression, and several other mental disorders. It helps to prevent certain kinds of cancer. And we also know that physical activity helps us when it comes to weight management, weight control. It helps with mental acuity and focus. It says there with specifically academic achievement in students, that's from a specific study. But we have also seen other studies now that show that it just helps with brain function in general, whether it's speed of processing or even just clarity of thought. Exercise has a big impact on helping our brain focus and operate well. So we know that there are just tons and tons of benefits to exercise. And so right away, we can already see that if only 1 in 5 adults are meeting these guidelines, that means 4 out of 5 aren't. It means 4 out of 5 are missing out on the positives that we can get from regular physical activity. And I say physical activity because even though I work in a gym and that's kind of my area of expertise, it doesn't have to be in a gym. The most important thing is that you're physically active, and that can be walking. It can be a job that's physically demanding. It can be a lot of different things. But the most important thing is that we're moving our body regularly. So I'm sure some of you see this and say, well, what's the big deal if I don't meet those recommendations? What's the issue here? Maybe you say well, I don't really care about a specific way my body looks, or maybe I'm not that concerned about lifting really heavy weight or running a certain distance. So why does it matter if I'm not necessarily getting those benefits from exercise? Well, part of the issue is not just that we're missing out on those benefits, but we also actually know that lack of exercise also increases health issues. We see that not only do we see a reduction in risk when we exercise regularly in those different areas I talked about, but we see a greater risk in those different areas, especially with heart issues, issues that are related to being overweight. A lot of those issues come from lack of physical activity. And so engaging in physical activity regularly doesn't just help us with getting some positive benefits, but it also protects us from some negative outcomes. And we're going to talk a little bit more about some of those possible negative outcomes from being sedentary that can exist. So the real issue here is really that our bodies are actually amazing. And the reason that's an issue is that our body has hundreds of thousands of processes going on at any given moment. We've got tons of things happening in our body, tons of procedures, tons of processes. That scratch on the back of your arm that you've already forgot about is demanding energy and resources in order to repair that scratch. Our eyes are demanding energy so that they can absorb light and electrically send that to our brains. And then our brain demands energy because that brain needs to process that information and tells us what we see. We've got so many different things going in our body, and they all are demanding resources and energy. And in order for our bodies to deal with all of that, we have to be efficient. And one of the most important ways that our body is efficient and, well, living is that it's extremely, extremely adaptable. And that can be both good and bad, and I'll explain why. So, there are a few ways that our body is adaptable to things. And if it sounds like I'm going off a tangent, I promise I'm not. I got a purpose to this. But some of the ways that our body is adaptable is one is it adapts to our environment. When our body starts to overheat, we sweat, right? And the goal of that sweat is for it to evaporate, which will cool down our skin. Or perhaps our body starts to get cold, and so we start to shiver. Our body will literally shake involuntarily if we're cold enough in order to create heat so that we can warm up. We also see that our body adapts to what we eat, to what we put in it. If we eat more calories than what we burn or need to function, then our body's really smart about that. And it says, okay, if I got too much, I'm not going to let it waste. I'm going to actually convert it to fat and store it for energy in case I need it later. And we may not like that, but it does definitely have a use. And while in today's society, for the most part, we don't need that as much, there is a reason why our body does that. And actually, I think one of the coolest examples of our body's ability to adapt to what we eat is the keto diet. And I'm not going to say if you should do it or if it's healthy. We're not going to dive into all that today in terms of the keto diet. That's a whole other discussion we could talk about. But what I find fascinating about the keto diet is that it's all based on a really simple principle. It's based on what's called ketosis. Basically, our body needs energy, right? And that energy, especially for physical activity, typically comes from carbohydrates or sugar. So the keto diet basically says, let's cut off that source of energy, our primary source that we use all the time. And what happens is our body has to adapt to that and say, okay, there's no carbs, let's find it somewhere else. And so instead, our body turns to fat cells and starts to convert fat into energy instead. And while our body does that naturally anyways, it doesn't resort to it first because, quite frankly, that process of using fat as energy isn't particularly efficient. It takes a little bit more time. It's not necessarily convenient for when we're trying to do something intense or trying to use a lot of energy. So our body prefers carbs, but if we cut that off from our body, it adapts to that and tries to find another way. That's why if you know someone who's done keto before, they often say that early on when you first start doing it, you feel really tired and like lacking energy. And a reason for that is your body is scrambling to try to find other sources and figure out how to work without carbs. And again, I'm not going to talk about whether or not that's healthy or good, but just know that our body is absolutely amazing at adapting. And that definitely brings us to really the meat and bones of today's discussion, which is that our bodies also adapt to activity. And what I mean by that is physical activity. And a lot of that we already know, right? We know that if we start running a lot, our body will adapt and we can start running farther and longer or faster. We know that if we keep lifting weights long enough, that we'll start to get stronger, maybe even build some muscle. We definitely know to an extent that our body does adapt to exercise. But I think it's equally important to understand that our bodies can adapt in the reverse way. Our bodies are designed to run, walk, bend, jump, twist. They are designed to move. We can tell that by literally looking at the biomechanics of how our body is structured. We have all these joints and muscles that are set up to where we have insane movement potential. We can jump and twist and move in all these crazy ways because we have so many different muscles. But not only do we have all these different muscles and nerves, but we're also able to use them all together in concert, which is absolutely incredible. Our bodies are really just a work of art with what we're able to accomplish when it comes to movement. But the problem is that our bodies are amazing and they're efficient. And so if we aren't doing regular physical activity, if we neglect physical activity, our body starts to say, okay, I probably can divert these resources elsewhere. And while your muscles aren't just going to magically disappear, right? They can definitely atrophy. And that is a common thing that happens when we don't exercise regularly, is that our muscles will start to shrink down and lose volume. We can also see that within activity, we can experience what's called denervation, where basically our nerves that are coming from our brain down into our muscles start to shrink because they're not having to fire as often and they're not being needed. And our body's not going to sit there and have something there that's just going to waste. Similarly, we can also experience muscular imbalances, something that we'll talk about a little bit more in a bit. But basically, because of those two previous things, we can often experience an imbalance where we have muscles that are overused on one side of the body. And as a result, the other side has not been used. And it causes joints to be pulled out of whack, causes a lot of discomfort and pain and limits movement. But that's another serious side effect that can come from not moving very often and being sedentary. So that's one of the main issues here, is that we see a lot of adults today are not doing that. And that's not to shame anyone by any means. 200 years ago, we had to be physically active because that's how we survived, right? We had to walk to go to work. Our work was probably physically demanding at the time. We had a lot of reasons to move. We had to run away from that wild animal. We had to do a lot of things that just required physical activity and never had to really think about fitness or having to train a certain way because it was just part of life. But what we see now today is that we don't need to move as much. And you see that second bullet point there, movements that are or may be required in our daily lives. Today, we just don't have as much required of us. Even now compared to 5 years ago, so much has changed, right? 5 years ago, if you want to get groceries, you had to go into the store, get a buggy, pick everything up. You pretty much had to do that unless you paid someone to do that. Now we can do it all on an app. We can literally pull into Walmart, hit a button, pop the trunk, and it's all there in your car. Everything is so incredibly convenient today that often we're experiencing a neglect in our own body and our movements, which ends up causing a lot of health issues as a result. And so what I want to talk about next is what's called functional movement. And some of you may have heard this before, some maybe not. I know when I first got into fitness and I heard the term functional movement, I just kind of rolled my eyes. I thought it was one of those like buzzwords or trendy things to say that sounds really good, but doesn't actually have any substance to it. But it actually has a lot of substance to it. And I've only recently in the past couple of years fully understand what it means when you say functional movement. And really all we mean when we say that is it's the ability for the body to be used to its full capacity, our joints and our muscles specifically. So a great example of that is, let's say our elbow, right? The function of our elbow is really just to flex and extend. And so when we think about the functional movement of our biceps and our elbow, our biceps function, our goal is to really flex the elbow and then also to resist the arm going down if it needs to. So flex and extend. Similarly, the backside of our arms, our triceps, the goal of that muscle is to extend the elbow and then to resist to resist flexion. And that's pretty much it. That is the functional movement of that part of the body. So if we're thinking of that on a broader term, looking at the whole body, we're thinking about what all these muscles are able and capable of doing based on where they're attached to and what joints are involved, what they're capable of doing. So the idea behind functional movement is that we are able and capable of using all these muscles that exist on our body regularly. And so that kind of ties into that second bullet point, which is movements that are, or I guess maybe should be, or have been at one point required in our daily lives. I've already said our lives don't require as much, but I still think when we think of functional movement today, there are still a lot of very practical applications. We should have enough movement or be able to walk a couple miles if we need to. We should be able to play a game with our kids if we need to. We should be able to pick up that heavy bag off the ground and put it up on the shelf if we need to. And if we aren't able to, that means that we are lacking certain functional movements in our bodies that we really need to improve the quality of our lives. And by the way, I almost forgot to mention, if at any point you have questions about what I'm talking about, feel free to drop them in the chat with the Q&A. I'm going to definitely leave a couple minutes at the end to answer questions that maybe aren't directly related to this, or maybe you didn't want to ask until the end, that's fine too. But just know that I love participation, I love questions. So if you got something, fire away. I don't mind taking a break, especially if it's something on the topic we're discussing. But anyways, let's move on. So we've identified functional movement. We've talked about a serious issue that's going on, which is so many people right now are not moving regularly. So what are we going to do about it? Well, the first thing that we can do in order to move better is we need to understand what the basic functional movements are, right? We've said, okay, functional movement, that sounds great, but to the average person, like, what does that even really mean, right? We can't realistically expect everyone to know all the many muscles, hundreds of muscles in the bodies and how they're supposed to move. Well, the great news is that a lot of really smart people who've spent a lot of time researching anatomy and biomechanics have already done this. And what we've done is we've already really identified 7 basic movements that we say all these movements combined are a very thorough, comprehensive look at movement of what the body is capable of. Just about any other movement can really be fit into one of these most likely. So if you're able to do all these movements on a regular basis, we're looking at a very well-rounded functional movement system. So let's dive into these real quick. I just want to identify them so you're comfortable with them, you can recognize them. If you're already currently doing some sort of like exercise program, I encourage you to think about if any of these movements are currently in your program. And I say movement because some of these might be the name of an exercise. Some of them might actually just be literally what the body is doing. And a lot of times, workout programs, even trainers or coaches, whatever, they might have a different name for an exercise, but that movement is still happening in there. So I encourage you, my goal with this is that you can look at these and start to say, okay, these are definitely functional movements. Are these being implemented in what I'm doing now? And if you're not doing anything now, this is a great place to start look at. So let's dive in. The first one is quite simply called gait. And it's what it looks like. It's really just walking or running. It's that movement that requires our legs to alternate back and forth. And the function is really quite explanatory, right? It's to be able to walk, to move, to travel ourselves. It's the most basic way that we get around is by walking. And so this is also one of the movements that is most neglected today, is quite simply walking. Like I said before, we are able to really, if we want to, avoid a lot of walking throughout the day. I mean, realistically, we could probably put all the walking we do in a day in like 1 hour if we really try to, even less, especially if we work at home. But there's a lot of ways that we can get around this. But I encourage you to think of ways to start adding this movement in more, because there are a lot of muscles and things going on with this movement that are necessary for our daily life. A lot of times we just think about as walking requiring our feet or our legs, but a lot of the muscles in our body are all being used for this. We have to use the muscles in our back, our upper back and arms in order to stand up straight. We're using our core to keep all of our joints stable as we're taking each step. And then obviously we are using our legs to actually propel ourselves forward. So walking is a very great exercise. It's a very basic one, but it's also a very necessary one that we need to do. And so any kind of exercise program or activity program that you're doing regularly should have some scheduled time for gait, for either walking or running, something where we're replicating this activity in a way that makes it challenging for our body. How challenging it is completely up to you, whether it's a walk or a jog, maybe it's a walk on an incline, maybe it's a run. But any way that we do it, it is important that we're engaging in this activity regularly. The second movement is going to be the squat. And I'm sure we've all heard of the squat, but it's a very simple functional movement that we do. And what it does is it helps to develop lower body strength. And it also helps with hip, knee, and ankle collaboration. In other words, all those joints in our lower body, it teaches those muscles and joints to work together. And so that's why it's a very unique and great lower body exercise, is because it uses so many muscles in the lower body all at once. And it teaches them to work together, which is really important. I'll talk about that more in a bit. But that's why the squat is such a great functional movement. And even just looking at, we can tell that that's a movement that we probably need in our daily lives, right? If we drop something on the ground, we need to squat down and pick it up. We can't just reach down and hope that it comes to us. Sometimes we got to get down again. Third movement is going to be the lunge. What separates this from a squat is that each leg is doing something different. In fact, I would compare it more to gait or walking than to a squat. There's definitely a lower body strength portion to it, but really what makes it unique is it helps us to strengthen our hip stability, and it also helps with balance as well. It's a really great exercise we should incorporate to help improve our balance and hip stability. And there are tons of variations out there. I forgot to mention with squats, but squats are pretty self-explanatory. It's really just where you might add weight. With lunges, it's pretty similar. It's taking a step forward, driving that knee towards the ground. And there's a lot of different ways that we can do that. Step ups are actually very similar to a lunge, as is reverse lunges. Ooh, I got a question. Just a second. Let's see. So one person asked, most people have knee issues. How would you accommodate squats and lunges for those people? That's a great question. First off, what I would say with both of these exercises is that if you have any knee issues, you probably don't need to do them with weight. Body weight is going to be the first way that you want to try to do these exercises. Now, if you're still having knee issues when it's body weight, that could be for a few reasons. One is it could be form. Any time that the knee goes farther than the toe, we're probably experiencing way too much stress on the knee. And so if you're doing a knee or lunge, I would pay attention to what your knees are doing. If you see that knee is farther forward than the toe, then right there, you know that's going to cause knee problems. Now, if that's not happening, you're still experiencing some issues, it's probably going to be something you want to get checked. What I will say is that there are ways to ease squats and lunges to make them slightly less difficult so there's less pressure on the knee that can still develop strength. A great example of that is having something in front of you to support you while you're doing a squat. That could even be as simple as having like a bar or a stand, something that's stable, and putting your hands on it and putting some of your weight into that when you go into a squat. Because ideally, your knee should still very much be capable of that movement. Even if it's not able to go down quite as far, you should still be able to flex at the knee, even if you normally have some issues. What I will say is, if none of that helps, I really recommend talking to a trainer or an expert to try to help decide what's going on with that knee. If you have a lot of serious issues, obviously you probably need to go to a doctor as well. But I will say a lot of times that the issues that we have with our knees when we're exercising, it's either because our form's not good, or it's because we're putting too much weight or resistance on the knee, and we need to figure out how to reduce that. That's a good question. And definitely, if you want to send me an email, we can chat about that more, because that's a great topic. A lot of people have questions about that. But yes, so we'll go ahead and move on. So we got the squat, we got the lunge, we've got gait. That pretty much well covers our lower body. But let's talk about the upper body a little bit. We also have a movement that's quite simply called push. And this uses a lot of the muscles in our upper body, so our chest, our shoulders, the back side of our arms. And it also teaches us to use all these joints in our upper body together. It teaches us to use our chest and shoulders, our elbows, our wrists. It's a really important movement because it doesn't just help develop strength, but it teaches them all to work together in concert. And that's a really important concept, is not just working each joint individually, but teaching your body to use it all together at once. That's an idea called specificity. If we've got some time, I'll talk about that more. But just know that ideally, we want to learn how to use our joints together, especially when it comes to a movement that's practical in real life. And I would say that pushing something is a pretty normal movement we need to be able to do. So incorporating that into our exercise program is really helpful. And there are tons of ways that we can do that. Just some simple examples are push-ups. He's doing in this picture an example of a push-up on an incline. If you have a hard time doing a push-up on the ground, push-up on an incline is completely acceptable. If it's challenging for you, then it's great. You can also do bench press. You can also do even a shoulder press as a push movement. So there's a lot of different ways that we can implement this. But just know that a push movement, pushing something away from the body, is a very important functional movement that helps to address a lot of the muscles in our upper body and the front side. Now, on the opposite, but similar, is going to be a pull. And that's going to be utilizing the muscles on the back side of our torso in order to pull something towards our body. So this is going to help with upper body strength as well. It's also working on using all those different joints in your arms at the same time. But what's also great about pull exercise is it's really good for posture. And one of the best ways to help improve our posture is to focus on our posture under stress, especially when we're having to deal with some sort of resistance. And so pull exercises are really, really important. I definitely recommend, if you don't do anything now, to start doing some pull exercises. A lot of the most common issues that we see today come from poor posture in the back. We have a lot of back issues, and a lot of that comes from not spending enough time working on our backs. So pull movements are an absolutely great way to help address the back side of our torso. A lot of good examples are out there, but just a few include back rows, which is what this guy is doing with the band, pull-ups, or even what she's doing here in this picture. That's a lat pull down. It's very similar to a pull-up. Body weight rows is another example. Like I said, there's a lot of different variations out there, but really any movement that's pulling weight towards the body, that's going to be a pull movement. The name's right there, right? Easy to remember, pull movement. So we've got push and we've got pull. Let's see what else we got. So we also have a bending movement, or I like to call it hinging. But basically what a bending movement is, it's when we hinge or bend at the waist. And one important thing to note about this, and is why I include that picture in the top left, is that it's really important that we try to maintain good posture anytime that we're doing a bending movement. I'm sure at least someone on this webinar has hurt their back before trying to pick up something heavy. And a lot of times you just hear people say, well, you need to bend your knees, use your legs. And that's certainly part of it, but actually a bigger issue that often results in back problems when we lift something that's too heavy is that we are not maintaining a straight back or good posture when we're picking up something healthy. And so bending is really good practice for that, because it teaches you to hinge at the waist while also maintaining your back posture during the process. So this is really helpful for lower back and hip strength, strength and stability. Also really important for posture as well. I already mentioned that, but it's really good to help with just learning to engage all the different muscles up along the back side of our spine. And there's a lot of different exercises that can do this. Deadlifts are a great example, but are also a very challenging exercise. So if you've never done it before, I don't recommend it without help from someone who knows what they're doing. But back extensions are another great example, and a much simpler example of an exercise that works on that hinging motion at the hips. There's also kettlebell swings, and there's a lot more. I also like that picture on the top left because she doesn't have any weight. She has a PVC pipe there just to demonstrate what a flat back looks like. But what I like about that is, for a lot of people, if you've never done this movement, and especially if you've been sedentary a lot, even myself, because I spend a lot of time sitting in my office, have to do this fairly frequently. And what you'll find is that if you've never done this before, it's actually really challenging to do even with no weight at all. You'll find that hinging at the hips with just your body weight, it can be enough of a challenge on its own that you can improve from it just by doing it regularly. So what I recommend is, if you've never done a bend or a hinge like this before, where you're really focusing on your upper body posture, squeezing those shoulders back, I recommend just practicing it by itself. If you really want to go crazy, you can grab a broom or a PVC pipe or something like she's doing and kind of get in the mirror and look. But this is just a really good way of practicing hinging at the hips in a way that's not going to put too much pressure on your back and hurt yourself. Really important movement. And honestly, one of the most neglected movements out there, especially if you don't exercise regularly. I know that when I first started exercising, it took me a very long time to get this movement down. Even when I first started personal training, I was actually scared to do it with clients because it took me so long to figure out how to do it right. So I recommend is that if you don't do it now, try to start practicing. And if you need to, you can always either get a trainer or reach out to someone you know is knowledgeable to help you get this down, because it's such an important movement that we really just don't practice enough. Oh, and by the way, that picture at the bottom right is a back extension on a ball. That's what that exercise is. It's almost like a crunch in reverse. Really good at targeting that lower back. All right, and then the final movement that we have is a twisting or rotation movement. And just like that sounds, it is twisting or rotating of the torso. Really important functional movement to address a lot of muscles that, if we don't do it otherwise, really don't get used enough until we need it, right? But this is really good for core strength and also core control. And I separate that out on purpose, because a lot of times when I see people doing core or ab exercises, I see them doing like with a lot of heavy weight. But when it comes to core and ab exercises, control is just as important as strength. You need to learn how to engage those muscles and do the movement carefully rather than rush through it. I'd rather see someone do crunches, or in this case, the guy with the cables doing it's just called a cable rotation. I'd rather see someone do that extremely slow and carefully and take their time than just try to rush through it. There's nothing impressive about trying to rush through that. In fact, if anything, it gets way harder when you slow core exercises and twisting, moving down to a much slower pace. Not only is it safer, but it's a lot more challenging, and it actually is going to have more carryover to real life because it's teaching you stability and control. But any kind of twisting of the torso is going to help with this movement. So some simple exercises, that cable rotation already mentioned. Russian twists is what the guy down there on the ground is doing. Wood choppers is another example. You could certainly Google and find a lot of other options as well, but those are just some easy examples there. But again, anything that causes rotation in the torso is going to be a good way to challenge that movement. So if you've ever seen someone do like a squat and then they like twist at the bottom, or maybe they do a lunge and twist, the reason they're adding that in, whether they realize it or not, is to add this functional component to it, to practice engaging those muscles in your core and your torso that twist your upper body. That's what that's for. All right, so those are the 7 movements. And so one of the things that we can immediately start to do to start moving better is to implement these movements into our regular routine. Or if you're not doing a regular routine of any kind, then what I'd recommend is to create a routine out of these simple movements. And so as an example, and my recommendation for doing this is to perform some variation of these movements at least 1 to 2 times per week. You could certainly do it more than that, but at least once, twice is better, but at least once a week, every single week, start to find ways to implement this movement. Walking is probably the easiest one to do, right? Just being more intentional and setting aside some time to walk. It can even be as simple as just walking 15, 20 minutes a day and trying to do that uninterrupted at a fairly quick pace. Easy way to start implementing more gait movement. But doing these movements 1 to 2 times per week, trying to do 2 to 3 sets of each of these movements. So not just doing it once and leaving it, but within a session, doing it 2 to 3 times. And then I put a range of 8 to 12 repetitions. And I know that's a broad range, but the reason for that is simply because it depends on the exercise and where you're at currently. You know, for some people here, doing push-ups on an incline like that picture I showed you is going to be really challenging, and just getting to 8 is probably going to be tough enough. Now for other people, they might do a lot of these already, and so doing 20 of them on the ground might be what they need to do in order for it to be a challenge. But if it's challenging, if it's exhausting, then it's probably working your muscles correctly. So 1 to 2 times per week, 2 to 3 sets is a good idea, 8 to 20 repetitions. A very basic example of how you could just look at this and do it yourself is, let's say we're going to work out twice a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays. And we're just going to work on these movements, just body weight, work on these movements. Let's say on Tuesday, I'm just going to put all the lower body ones together. So maybe I do a walk before I exercise, and then I do a walk again after. That addresses that gait movement. And then I do some squats, and then I do some lunges. So maybe I do 3 sets of 15 body weight squats, 3 sets of 10 to 15 lunges on each leg. That right there is good. That is a great start. That is addressing all those functional movements of the lower body, and is absolutely a great start. And if you do that regularly, you will get results from it. And then let's say on Thursday, I just do the rest of them. I do a push movement, I do a pull, maybe I do a bending movement and a twisting movement. And maybe that's all I do right now. I do 3 sets, 10 pushes, 10 pulls. I do 10 to 15 bends with no weight, just working on that movement. And then doing some sort of twisting exercise, maybe perhaps on the ground, like that Russian twist. That is a great start to a program that is going to help us move better in our daily lives, because we are addressing all of our major muscle groups. We are addressing them in movements that are practical and carry over to our regular daily lives. And we're going to start to see some results from. If we start to do that regularly, our body is going to stop saying, oh, we don't need resources there, we're not going to worry about it. Our body is going to start directing resources to those muscles. We'll start to see more nerves in those muscles so that they fire better and more efficient. We might start to see a little bit more muscle in those areas, not a ton, but we might see some muscles growth in those areas. And we might see some of those muscle imbalances start to correct themselves a little bit if we're intentional on doing this regularly. And I know that little section right there was a lot of content. So does anyone have any questions before I move to the next part about any of those movements? One question that I imagine some might be thinking, and we'll get to here in a bit, is what about all the other exercises out there? If you're thinking that, hold on to that thought. We're going to get to that here in a second. It's a good point. But these are all the basic functional movement patterns that if we do regularly is going to address most of our body. So let's talk a little bit about troubleshooting, how to deal with maybe we're having some issues with this. So let's talk about it. So after you've tried these movements, maybe you already do them, but I'd recommend, maybe this afternoon, maybe you do it right after this, because otherwise 2 o'clock, easy to get tired, fall asleep. Maybe get up and try a couple of these movements in your office. Don't tell your boss I said that. But go ahead and try some of these movements whenever you can. And then I want you to ask yourself, it's a little self-assessment period. Which of these movements was the most challenging? And which ones were the easiest? That's also helpful to know. And did you have any trouble doing any of these movements? And what I mean by that is, were they challenging, but did you actually struggle to do it at all? Maybe you watched a video on it and then went and got in the mirror and tried to replicate it and you weren't able to do it. So ask that question, did I have any troubles doing it? What we find is that oftentimes if one movement in particular is especially hard to do, you're able to do it, but it's really hard. That's a very good example of muscle weakness. That muscle is not being used enough regularly, and that's being underutilized. So if we've noticed that one movement in particular is really hard, then that's a good sign that we have some weaknesses there. And it also means that we need to do it more, if anything. I know it might be hard, but it means that we need to work on something there. Now, if we're noticing a complete inability to do it, let's say we're watching someone do it and we're watching in the mirror, we're trying to replicate it, and we're just unable to replicate it. We can't move our shoulders the right way, or we can't go as low as they do. There's a very good chance that that is an example of some sort of muscular imbalance that we have that exists. It's that, or even some tightness, or both. And what that might mean is that we have some muscles that are pulling us in a direction that limits our movement and makes it really hard to do the movement correctly. And like I said earlier on this presentation, if you have some sort of muscular imbalance, and spoiler, probably 99% of you do. I know I actually do. Muscular imbalances are so common today because we are so sedentary. But if you have one of these imbalances and it starts to get more severe, it will limit our movement. And so if you try some of these movements and you just can't replicate it, there's a very good chance that you've got something going on. Now, one thing I would recommend here, now I am going to provide some suggestions, examples of how to work on this. But one thing I'll go ahead and say is that if it's really a struggle to do these movements and you can't figure it out, I would really recommend seeking help, whether it's from a personal trainer, someone that you trust and know is good at this. But I really recommend, even if it's just like a consultation, something like that. That is something we do over here at the Rec Center. We do consultations. Sometimes that might be enough to identify exactly what's going on and help you move better. But we want to try to address as quickly as possible. The worst thing that we can do is just ignore it. Because what often happens with muscular imbalances, they get worse and worse and worse. It destroys our posture. And then we start experiencing injuries as a result. And doctors are amazing and awesome. But a lot of times doctors focus on curing and fixing. They don't often focus on the prevention part. So if we can try to start preventing these things earlier on by fixing these imbalances, then we can avoid a lot of heartache and struggle and poor movement further down the line. Okay, so what I wanted to do with this, and I'm not going to dive too deep into this, but I think it's really important that each of you have just a basic understanding of some very common muscular imbalances. I know that after I learned these, it kind of ruined me, because now everywhere I walk, I see these everywhere. I promise if we sat and looked at each person in here, there's a very good chance at least half of you have one of these going on, even if it's slightly. I know I do. But it's really good to have understanding what these are, because then if nothing else, you might recognize that you have it, and that is something that you need to work on. And the first one is called upper cross syndrome. It's also called kyphosis. Those names might sound scary, but really all it is it's forward rounded, hunched shoulders. So that bottom left is a picture of someone with good posture and is fairly well balanced with the muscles in their upper body. And the right picture is an example of what kyphosis looks like. If you have rounded shoulders like this, where the shoulders are noticeably farther forward than the back, and we see the ears are a lot farther forward than the shoulders, that is a very good chance that that person has kyphosis. And what that is, and there's a lot of technical terms here on this, but really what it is it's excessive rounding and tightness that is up here in the front part of our body. And so specifically with this, the problem is an extremely tight chest and shoulders, and then also a lot of tightness up here on the back side of the neck. So if you spend a lot of time at a desk, then you're very much susceptible to getting kyphosis at some point. You spend a lot of time hunched forward, sitting forward, using your phone, watching TV on the computer. In other words, most of us, we're very susceptible to developing this muscular imbalance, where we get really tight in the chest and neck. And then also, as a result of that tightness and that pulling forward, we see a over weakness in that mid lower back, and then also on the front sides of our neck. If you get a lot of tightness and uncomfort here at the base of the skull, a lot of times that's also a result of this, that upper trapezius muscle and a few others. If you get a lot of, if you dig into right back here and it's like really kind of painful, I'm sure some of you are doing that now, there's a chance that these muscles are really over tight and overused. And so we need to work on loosening and stretching those, which we'll get to in a bit. But just know this one is really common. There's a very good chance you see this and you're like, wow, that's definitely me. And that means it's something that we need to work on, because this can absolutely limit our ability to do some of those functional movements in the upper body. Okay, another one is called lower cross syndrome. It's also called an anterior pelvic tilt. What that means is that the pelvis is rotated forward. So an easy way to see this or identify it is an excessive curve in the lower back. And what is happening there is, once again, we're seeing this imbalance where certain muscles are way too tight, and as a result, the other muscles are loose. They're not being used correctly. And so in this case, those very tight muscles are going to be in the lower back, as well as the hips. And then we're going to see a lot of weakness in our abdominal muscles and then our glutes. Okay. So just know that this is also very common, and it can absolutely affect our ability to squat and to lunge and to even hinge forward, especially if we have this imbalance. So if you have a lot of pain, especially in these tight areas that you see on here, that lower back or those hip flexor area, there's a chance that you might have the beginnings of this or this lower cross syndrome. And I'm not telling you to go out there and self-diagnose necessarily, but it is good to be aware of this and try to look and find some solutions, whether it's from a professional or doing your own research. And then one other common imbalance. And by the way, I'm just touching on 3 of these today because they're the most common and also can be the most dangerous. But there are a lot of other ones out there that exist. We could spend, we could do a 5-part, 2-hour each series talking about all of these. But this is a very quick look at these in very general, just to give you an idea. But this third one is called a posterior pelvic tilt. And all it really is it's when your pelvis is tucked forward. It's the exact opposite of what we just saw. I know that for whatever reason, I and most of the men in my family have this. It seems to be genetic, I don't know. But what happens here is that we see the exact opposite in terms of overly tight muscles and also in unused or weak muscles here. So in this case, the tight muscles are going to be the abdominals and hamstrings, as well as the glutes, and then also extremely underactive lower back muscles and then hip flexors. And I don't expect you to remember all of these necessarily. In fact, I'll send all these to Ashley, and they'll send out the PowerPoint to you guys, or at least have it available. But it's really helpful information to know this. Because if you recognize this posture in yourself, then it means that there's something that we need to work on. And I realized actually this posture in myself was the reason that I was continually hurting my back all throughout high school and even into college. And even today, I still experience back issues if I'm not careful, because I have these overactive tight muscles in certain areas, and the other ones are weaker in comparison and looser. So I've got to really work on strengthening those loose muscles and lengthening those tight ones. And so to finish up this troubleshooting portion and most of today's discussion, to correct an imbalance, my first recommendation is to try to seek help if you can, especially if it's gotten to a point where you really struggle to complete any of these movements. It means that you probably need to get some help, even if it's temporary, maybe just one session with a trainer, something like that. But I really recommend seeking some help to deal with this, because if you just ignore it, our bodies don't always necessarily self-correct without a little bit of pushing in the right direction, especially if you're not able to engage those muscles that are weak and loose. We got to learn how to do that. Sometimes that takes a little help. With that being said, the basic premise behind correcting these imbalances is a combination of strengthening those underactive and those loose muscles. So if you go back and look at each of those slides, you can see, okay, the ones that are underactive or loose, I need to strengthen. And then the ones that are tight and overactive, I need to stretch. It's a very simple way of addressing this that'll go a long ways towards correcting that imbalance. And just as a sort of a tip, perform the movements that you're able to. If you do experience some serious difficulties with some of these movements, maybe you can't do the hinge correctly, don't neglect the other ones. Still do them. Do them as regularly and often as you can. Try to perform what you're able to do and do it in a range of motion that doesn't cause pain. And what I mean by that is, say you look up a video of someone doing that hip hinge, and the person in the video, they can go all the way down to 90 degrees and back up. You might not be able to do a full 90 degrees without it hurting. Don't do it all the way if it hurts. Do what you can feel comfortably, that you can maintain that posture and then come back up. It may just be that with time and as you develop strength, you can increase that range of motion, but don't force it. Just do the movement that you're capable of doing. And oftentimes what you find is that if you continue to stretch, if you continue to repeat that movement over and over again, that you might start to increase that range of motion over time. So just a tip there with these. So real quick, these are two questions I feel like are really commonly asked in regards to this. I just want to go ahead and address them. First one being is, how is this different from simply exercising all the muscles? Why do I need to do a squat versus doing a glute exercise and then doing a quad exercise and then doing a calf exercise? What's the difference? The difference is that is all dependent on this term in the fitness world that we call specificity, which basically says is that in order to train and get better at a certain movement, we need to do that exact movement. And so if we train the glutes by themselves, if we train the quads and the calves by themselves, those muscles can definitely get stronger and better. But when we do a squat, we are teaching all those things to work together. And that's really important for our brain and for our nerves to be able to work all of those systems together at once. Because otherwise the carryover is not as good and is not as relevant to real world movement. So that's the reason that why we want to do these functional movements rather than just going into the gym and pretending we're a bodybuilder and just do biceps and just do shoulders and separate it all out. there's nothing wrong with those exercises by themselves, but we also need to make sure we're doing these functional movements as well. So I really encourage you that if you currently don't do those functional movements, to add them in, because just hitting muscles by themselves doesn't have the same neuromuscular benefits, doesn't have the same benefit for our brain that doing these movements together has. And that's where all these other exercises fit in. We can add them in when we want to focus on specific things. You know, if you say, well, I want stronger arms, so I'm not going to just do a push or a pull. I want to do some bicep curls or tricep extensions. That's totally fine. Those are great things to supplement these other functional movements. But at the core of what we do, we need to include those very basic fundamental movements that carry over to our regular life. Otherwise, we're just not going to get the same benefit that carries over to the real world. So I do encourage you to still do all those other exercises, but if you got to choose only a few, let's focus on those movements that challenge our whole system and not just our arms or our glutes or our calves. Okay, I know we're almost out of time, but I wanted to leave a few minutes for questions. Be sure to check out anything or the other things that University Recreation has to offer. We've got a group exercise schedule. We've got personal training, which is awesome. I'm biased because I manage that. But we can even do consultations to help address or identify some of these muscular imbalances if you think you might have them. So if you ever have any questions or want to reach out, my info is there at the bottom of the page. It's my phone number, email address. You don't have to be a member at the rec center to ask or have questions. I'm more than happy to have a discussion with you just because I love talking about this stuff. But that's pretty much it for today. Like I said, I'm going to hang out for questions, but I thank you all so much for tuning in today and talking about movement and moving better. The basic premise to moving better is to start incorporating these functional movements in your daily lives. One person asked, is group personal training available? Right now, we're not doing group personal training. We do have some group programs that we do. So for example, starting tomorrow, actually, we have a program called Mayhem, which is outdoor personal training with sledgehammers and tires, a lot of functional movements there. But about every semester, we have some sort of program. So for example, in the summer, we're gonna have a program called Summer Heat, which is usually a fairly small group, anywhere from 5 to 15 people in each group. And it's a 6-week program where we're learning the basics of exercise and how to do different movements correctly. It's a really good program. So if you're more interested in a group setting, I recommend that. But right now we aren't doing group personal training. That's something hopefully we can get back to in the future. But right now it's just a spacing issue. So right now, in terms of working one-on-one with a trainer, we only do that one-on-one or in partners, in groups. Great question, though. Absolutely. Any other questions? All right, well, like I said, I'll hang out here. Thanks again for tuning in, guys. Hope you learned something different or something new today. I'll make sure that Ashley and Health Promotion and Wellness has this PowerPoint. We're recording this, hopefully, so it is recording, okay. It is recording, so it will be posted online as well. But I will continue to hang out, answer any questions you got, anything at all. Yes, thank you. Have a great day, guys. Yes, thank you. Thanks for tuning in. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and sign off. You all have a wonderful weekend and a wonderful week ahead. I look forward to seeing you all around the rec center. Have a great day.